Part 3, Chapter 6 of Mushrooms on the Moor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lillis. Mushrooms on the Moor by Frank W. Boreham. Part 3, Chapter 6. The Mistress of the Margin. I love a margin. There is something delicious, luxurious, glorious in the spacious field of creamy paper bounded by the black letterpress on the one side and the gilt edges on the other. Could anything be more abominable than a book that is printed to the uttermost extremities of every page? It is an outrage, I aver, on human nature. Indeed, it is an outrage on nature herself, for nature loves her margins even more than I do. She goes in for margins on a truly stupendous scale. She wants a bird, so a dozen are hatched. She knows perfectly well that 11 out of the 12 are merely margin. She will throw them to the cats and the foxes and the weasels and the snakes, and only keep the best of the batch. She wants a tree, so she plants 100. She knows that 99 are margin, to be browsed down by cattle, but she means to make sure of her one. The roe of a cod, Grant Alien tells me, contains nearly 10 million eggs, but if each of those eggs produced a fish which arrived at maturity, the whole sea would immediately become a solid mass of closely packed codfish. But nature has no intention of turning her bright blue ocean into a gigantic box of sardines. She is simply providing herself with a margin. Linnaeus says that a fly may multiply itself 10,000-fold in a fortnight. If this increase continued through the 3 summer months, he says, one fly at the beginning of summer would produce 100 millions of millions of millions before the 3 months were over, and the air would be black with the horror. The probability, however, is that there are never 100 millions of millions of millions of flies in the whole world. Nature is not arranging for a repetition of the plague of Egypt. She is simply gratifying her appetite for a margin. As Tennyson sings in Memoriam, of 50 seeds she often brings but one to bear. So I suppose I learned my love of margins from her. At any rate, if anyone thinks me extravagant, they must quarrel with her and not with me. I fancy there's a good deal in it. It is the margin that makes all the difference. If the work that absolutely must be done occupies every waking moment of my time, I am a slave. But if it leaves a margin of a single hour, I am in clover. If my receipts will only just balance my expenditure, I am living a mere hand-to-mouth existence. But if they leave me a margin, I jingle the odd coins in my pocket with the pride of a prince. Mr. Micawber's philosophy comes back to us. Quote, annual income £20, annual expenditure 19.19.6. Result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20.06. Result, misery. End quote. I believe that one of the supreme aims of a man's life should be to secure a margin. Nature does it, and we must copy her. A good life, like a good book, should have a good margin. I hate books whose pages are so crowded that you cannot handle them without putting your thumbs on the type. And in exactly the same way, there are very few things more repelling than the feeling that a man has no time for you. It may be a most excellent book, but if it has no margin, I shall never grow fond of it. He may be a most excellent man, but if he lacks leisure, restfulness, and poise, I shall never be able to love him. It is difficult to account for it, but the fact most certainly is that the most winsome people in the world are the people who make you feel that they are never in a hurry. The man whom you trust most readily is a man with a little time to spare, or who makes you think that he has. When my life gets tangled and twisted, and I want a minister to help me, I shall be too timid to approach the man who is always in a fluster. I feel instinctively that he is far too busy for poor me. He tears through life like a superannuated whirlwind. If I meet him on the street, his coat-tails are always flying out behind him, his eyes wear a haunted look, and a sense of feverish haste is stamped upon his countenance. He reminds me of poor John Gilpin, for it is always neck or nothing with him. He seems to be everlastingly consulting his watch, and is always muttering something about his next engagement. He gets through an amazing number of odd jobs in the course of a day, and his diary will be a wonder to posterity, but he would be much better off in the long run if he cultivated a margin. He makes people feel at present that he is far too busy for them. A poor woman who is in great trouble about her son heard him preach last Sunday and felt that she would give anything to have a quiet talk with him about her sorrow, and kneel with him as he commended both her and her wayward boy to the throne of heavenly grace. But she dreads to be caught in the whirl of his week-a-day flurry, and stays away, her grief eating her heart out the while. A shrinking young girl is in perplexity about her love affairs, and she feels sure, from some things he said in his sermon a few weeks ago, that he could help her. But she remembers that in his study he keeps a motto to remind her that his time is precious. If the words, "Beware of the dog," were painted on his study door, they could not have been more terrifying. She fears that, before she has half unfolded the tender tale that she scarcely likes to tell, his hand will be upon the doorknob. The tendency of the time is indisputably towards flurry. The flurry of business or the flurry of pleasure. I feel very sorry for those busy folk. Their energy is prodigious, but for all that they are losing life's best. Surely William Cowper had a secret in his soul when he told us that, in his mad career, John Gilpin lost the wine. And now as he went bowing down, his reeking head full low, the bottles twain behind his back were shattered at a blow. Down ran the wine into the road, most piteous to be seen, which made his horse's flanks to smoke, as they had basted been. It is very easy to go too fast. In his Forest, Mr. Stuart White gives us some lessons in bushmanship. Quote, "As long as you restrain yourself," he says, "to a certain leisurely plodding, you get along without extraordinary effort, but even a slight increase of speed drags fiercely at your feet. One good step is worth 6 stumbling steps. Go only fast enough to assure that good one. An expert woods walker is never in a hurry." End quote. I was chatting the other day with the captain of a great steamship. The vessel is capable of steaming at the rate of 17 knots an hour, but I noticed from the log that she never exceeds 15. I asked the reason. "It's too expensive," the captain answered. And then he told me the difference in the consumption of coal between steaming at 15 and steaming at 17 knots an hour. It was astounding. I recognized at once his wisdom in keeping the margin. When I next meet my busy brother I shall tell him the story, if he can spare the time to listen. For apart from the expense to himself of driving the engines at that high pressure, and apart from the loss of the wine, I feel sure that the folk who most need him love the ministry of a man with a margin. Even as I write, there rush back upon my mind the memories of great doctors and eminent lawyers whose biographies I have read. How careful these busy men were to convey a certain impression of leisureliness. It will never do for a doctor to burst in upon his poor feverish patient and throw everything into commotion. And see how composedly the lawyer listens to his client's tale. Wise men these, and I must not be too proud to learn from them. Great souls have ever been leisurely souls. I have no right to allow the rush and throb and tear of life to rob me of my restfulness. I must keep a quiet heart. I must be jealous of my margins. I must find time to climb the hills, to scour the valleys, to explore the bush, to row on the river, to stroll along the sands, to poke among the rocks, and to fish in the stream. I must cultivate the friendship of the fields and the ferns and the flowers. I must lie back in my easy-chair with my feet on the fender and laugh with my friends. And pity me, men and angels, if I am too busy to romp with the children and to tell them a tale if they want it. There are many things in a man's life that he can give up, just as there are many things in a book that can be skipped. But the last thing to go must be the margin. Now, rising from my desk for a moment, just to stretch my legs a little, I glance out of my study window at the busy world outside. I see men making bargains, reading newspapers, and talking politics. And really, when you come to analyze the thing, this matter of margins touches the bustling world at every point. To begin with, the essential difference between life here in Australia and life in the Old World is mainly a difference in the breadth of the margin. Here life is not so hemmed in and cramped up as it must of necessity be there. The whole tendency of modern legislation is in the direction of widening the margin. Everything tends to increase the leisure of the people. Early closing has come into its own. Shopkeepers put up their shutters quite early in the morning. The hours of the labourer have been considerably curtailed, and in other ways the leisure of the people has been greatly increased. Now in this broadening of life's margin there lie both tremendous possibilities and tremendous perils. The idleness of an entire community during a considerable portion of its waking hours may become a huge national asset or a serious menace to the general well-being. People are too apt to suppose that character is determined by the main business of life. It is a fallacy. It is, as I have said, the margin that really matters. There is a section of time that remains to a man after the main business of life has been dealt with. It is the use to which that margin is put that reveals the true propensities of the individual, and that, in the long run, determines the destiny of the nation. Here, for example, are 2 bricklayers. They walk down the street side by side on their way to work. From the time that the hour strikes for them to commence operations until the time comes to lay aside their trowels for the day, they are pretty much alike. The one may be a philosopher and the other a scoundrel, but these traits will have small opportunity of betraying themselves as they chip away at the bricks in their hands and ply their busy tasks. The intellectual proclivities of the one and the vicious propensities of the other will be held in the severest restraint as they labour side by side. The inexorable laws of industrial competition will keep their work up to a certain standard of excellence. But the moment that the tools are thrown aside, the character of each man stands revealed. He is his own master. He is like a hound unleashed, and will not follow his bent without let or hindrance. And the more the state restricts the hours of toil and multiplies the hours of leisure, the more does it increase the possibilities of good in the one case and the perils of evil-doing in the other. It is during that lengthened leisure that the one will apply himself to self-improvement, and by developing himself will increase the value of his citizenship to the state. And it is during the prolonged immunity from restraint that the other will compass his own deterioration and exert his influence for the general impoverishment. Precisely the same law holds good in relation to the expenditure of money. The way in which a people spends its money represents the most crucial test of a national character. If a man spends his money wisely, he is a wise man. If he spends his money foolishly, he is a foolish man. But it is not along the main line of expenditure that revelation is made. The principal items of expenditure are inevitable, and beyond the control of the individual, whoever or whatever he may be. A man must eat and wear clothes, whether he be a burglar or a bishop. The butcher, the baker and grocer, and the milkman will call at every door, and you cannot argue as to the morals of a man from the fact that he eats bread, and he is fond of beef, or that he takes sugar with his porridge. There are certain main lines of expenditure along which each man, whatever his characteristics and idiosyncrasies, is resistlessly driven. But after he has submitted to this stern compulsion, and has paid his butcher, his baker, his grocer, and his milkman, then comes the test. What about the margin? Is there a margin? For upon the margin everything depends. We will suppose that, after paying for the things that he eats and the things that he wears, he still jingles in his pocket a dozen coins, with which he may do exactly as he likes. Now it is in the expenditure of that margin of money, as in the other case it was the expenditure of the margin of leisure, that the real man will reveal himself. It is the use to which he puts the margin that declares his true character and determines the contribution that he, as an individual citizen, will make to the national weal or woe. Now, if this broadening margin means anything at all, it means that the responsibilities of the Church are increasing. For the Church is essentially the mistress of the margin. Concerning the expenditure of the hours occupied with labour, and concerning the money spent in the actual requisites of life, the statesman may have something to say. Legislation may deal with the hours of labour and the rates of wages. It may even influence the precise amount of the butcher's or the baker's bills. But when it comes to the hours that follow toil, and to the cash that remains after the principal accounts have been paid, the legislator finds himself in difficulties. He has come to the end of his tether. He cannot direct the people as to how to spend their spare cash. And, as we have seen, it is just this spare time and spare cash that determine everything. It is the dominating and deciding factor in the whole situation. It is manifest, therefore, that, important as are the functions of statesmanship, the really fundamental factors of the individual conduct and of national life elude the most searching enactments of the most vigilant legislators. As the hours of labour shorten, and as the margin of spare cash increases, the authority of the legislator becomes less and less, and the need for some force that shall shape the moral tone of the people becomes greater and greater. If the Church cannot supply that force and become the mistress of the margin, the outlook is by no means reassuring. On one phrase of this matter of the margin, the Church holds a wonderful secret. She knows that there are people who, through no fault of their own, are marginless. They have neither a moment nor a penny to spare. Sickness, trouble, and the war of the world have been too much for them. They are right up against the wall, and they know it. But the matter does not end there. I remember once entering a dingy little dwelling in the slums of London. In the squalid room a cripple girl sat sewing, and as she sewed she sang. My Father is rich in houses and lands, he holdeth the wealth of the world in his hands. Of rubies and diamonds, of silver and gold, his coffers are full, and has riches untold. I am the child of a king, the child of a king. I'm the child of a king, the child of a king. With Jesus my Saviour, I'm the child of a king. What did this mean but that she had discovered that her cramped and narrow life had a spacious white margin after all? In a recent speech at Glasgow, Mr. Lloyd George told a fine story of a quaint old Welsh preacher who was conducting the funeral service of a poor old fellow, a member of his church who, through no fault of his own, had a very bad time of it. They could hardly find a space in the churchyard for his tomb. At last they got enough to make a brickless grave amongst the towering monuments that pressed upon it, and the old minister, standing above it, said, "Well, Davy, you have had a narrow time right through life, and you have a very narrow place in death. But never you mind, old friend. I can see a day dawning for you when you will rise up out of your narrow bed and find plenty of room at the last. Ah, he cried, in a burst of natural eloquence, I can see it coming. I can see that day of resurrection. I can see the dawn of immortality. There will be room, 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 even for the poor. The light of that morning already gilds the hilltops. What did he mean, that old Welsh minister, as he shaded his eyes with his hands and looked towards the east? He was pointing away from life's black and crowded letterpress to the white and spacious margin, the margin with the gilt edge. That was all. End of Part 3, Chapter 6.